The smoke burns my throat as I kneel beside the fallen. The air tastes of iron and ash, and the snow outside the longhouse glows red with reflected fire. I can still hear the cries of women echoing between the timbers, not from the battle, but from what follows it. Did you know that when a Viking fell in war, his wife did not inherit his freedom? She became the prize of the man who killed him. I have seen it with my own eyes, women handed over like spoils, their vows dissolved by death, their fates decided by the blade that struck their husband down. This is Viking life, merciless, unflinching, and absolute. Stay with me and witness the truth behind it. When the sun lifted over the shattered fields of Clonmacnoise, its light fell on smoke instead of dawn. The grass was slick with blood, and the air hummed with the soft sound of flies already gathering to feed. The Vikings moved through the wreckage like men possessed, stepping over the bodies of monks and warriors alike. The battle was over, yet what followed was only beginning. From the smouldering ruins of the monastery came the scent of burning vellum holy books, curling to ash, and beneath them the soft weeping of survivors who would never again see their homes. Those taken alive were herded toward the longships, but not all were bound for chains. The victors had other customs. The wives of the fallen stood apart, their faces grey with ash and grief, while the warriors counted them as spoils. To the Norse, possession was proof of strength. If a man had slain another, his right extended to all that man had owned, cattle, weapons, and wife alike. The living became part of the inheritance of death. A woman's fate could be declared with the same calm tone a man used to claim a blade or a cloak. A young woman named Maya, wife to a slain chieftain, stood before the leader of the raiders. Her husband's shield lay shattered beside her feet, its boss dented by the axe that had ended him. She said nothing. Silence was the only weapon left to her. The Viking warlord, broad as an oak and streaked with the filth of battle, studied her like one studies a horse at market. The men behind him murmured wagers on who would take her. None spoke her name. It had already been erased by conquest. The law of the North demanded witnesses, so 3 warriors stepped forward, hands raised to the sky, and heard the claim spoken aloud. The chieftain recited her husband's death, his own victory, and his right by the sword. The act was not madness. It was order. The gods were watching. Her future had become a ledger written in blood. By that law, she ceased to be a widow and became a possession, what the old codes called Kona Aigda, an owned woman. As the day wore on, the spoils were divided. Silver melted, chalices hammered into bracelets, and the women distributed according to rank. Some were marched to the ships, their cries fading into the crash of waves. Others, like Mare, were taken into the longhouse to serve new masters before sunset. The monks' bells lay shattered in the dirt, but the sound of their iron still echoed in the women's hearts. The ashes of victory clung to everything, to hair, to skin, to the memory of what had been sacred. By nightfall, the firelight flickered through the broken doors of the monastery. Laughter rose from within, mingled with sobs. Outside, the ravens gathered on the roof beams, waiting for what the warriors would leave behind. In that silence between screams, history was written not in ink, but in smoke. The market square of Dublin stank of iron and sweat. The smoke from 100 torches blurred the river into a red haze, reflecting the glow of trade long after sunset. Crates of amber, piles of furs, and cages filled with people lined the wooden quay. The buyers came early, armed not with swords but with scales. They spoke in Norse, Frankish, and the softer tongue of the Gaels. Each word carried the same purpose, the valuation of human worth. In the centre stood a woman draped in the remnants of royal silk. Her name had once been Era, wife of a fallen sea king, whose banner was now nailed to the mast of her captor's ship. Her crown, melted down the previous night, had been divided among the raiders as coin. To them she was no longer queen, but merchandise. Her wrists bore the mark of iron cuffs polished by many hands before hers. She had been cleaned, perfumed and displayed, as though dignity could make her worth more silver. A Norse trader named Hrold kept the tally. His beard was flecked with frost and old blood, his eyes sharp as the knives he used to cut samples of cloth. He moved among the captives, examining teeth, hair, and age. He stopped before Eira and measured her like a craftsman inspecting a rare tool. Her silence pleased him. He lifted her chin with a stick and spoke the number aloud, 20 marks of silver. The crowd murmured. That was the price of a good longship. Some buyers crossed themselves in quiet awe, others nodded with grim respect. A queen's worth was high, but still finite. The record-keeper carved it into a runestone beside the dock. The stone survives still, half buried by centuries of silt. The symbols are plain: a woman's price, a transaction made lawful by witnesses. No saga calls her by name, no poem sings her lament. Yet archaeology tells her story, a royal grave empty in Norway, a ring of foreign silver found in Dublin's soil, its weight matching her ransom. She was not ransomed. The record ends with a single mark: sold. As the tide turned, the longships rocked gently against their moorings. Eira was led aboard one of them, bound for the settlements across the sea. The men who watched her go felt no guilt. They believed they were honouring her husband's strength by preserving her in the service of the victor. To be taken by a warrior was, in their law, to remain within the world of the living. To resist was to invite the pit. That night, as rain fell on the torches, her captor held the melted fragments of her crown in his palm. The gold glowed dully in the firelight. He tucked the metal into his belt pouch and turned toward the sea. The ship creaked, the oars dipped, and the sound of chains merged with the rhythm of the waves. The price of a queen was paid, and the ocean kept its receipt. When the sword fell, it did not end with death. Among the Norse, every man's life was a chain of property, wife, house, livestock, honour, all bound together by the same law. When one link broke, another claimed it. The woman left behind became proof of conquest, a living extension of her husband's defeat. To the warriors who stood upon the blood-soaked fields, this was not cruelty, it was justice. After the raid at Strangfjord, the victors gathered in the smoky hall to divide spoils. They spread the taken goods across the floor: gold brooches, cattle horns, carved crosses from a plundered chapel. Yet it was not these that drew their eyes, but the women kneeling at the back, veiled, trembling, waiting for their fates to be spoken aloud. No coin changed hands yet. First, the claims must be declared. A grey-bearded lawman named Torgrim rose to preside. He had fought in 20 winters and carried the authority of the Gragas, the great Icelandic code, written to tame the chaos of war. His task was simple: assign ownership of the fallen men's wives. The rules were ancient, carved into memory long before ink or parchment. A warrior could claim the wife of any man he had slain, but only if he spoke the claim within 3 days, before witnesses and under the eyes of the gods. Failure meant forfeiture and violence. One by one, the men stepped forward to speak their rights. They declared the names of the slain, described the death blows that won them their claim, and pointed to the widows like farmers naming their fields. Each word sealed a bond that no priest could undo. The women had no voice in this process. Even the gods were invoked only to witness, not to judge. At the far end of the hall stood Astrid, wife of Hakon the Younger. She still wore his amulet, a small Thor's hammer, stained with dried blood. The man who had killed him, Eric Skullsplitter, came forward to claim her. His voice was clear, practiced, almost ceremonial. Torgrim nodded, recorded the claim aloud, and struck the haft of his staff upon the ground. The law was satisfied. The room cheered. Astrid did not move. That night, the warriors feasted. They drank from cups still warm from looted altars. Torgrim, the lawman, sat apart, his expression unreadable. He had kept order, preserved custom, upheld the code that made Norsemen civilized in their own eyes. But as the fire burned low, he saw Astrid's amulet glinting in the shadows, and for a moment he faltered. The law of the fallen had been spoken, yet something in the air felt wrong, as if the gods themselves were listening too closely. Outside, the wind howled across the fjord, carrying the sound of laughter and the faint echo of a woman's sob. In the north, that was the sound of justice fulfilled. In the wide valley of Thingvellir, the earth itself formed the walls of a court. Basalt cliffs rose on either side like frozen waves, and between them the people gathered, chieftains in furs, farmers in rough wool, traders with dust still clinging to their boots. Smoke from campfires curled into the grey sky, mixing with the drone of voices debating the law. The Althing was not merely a gathering, it was the spine of their world. Every oath, every punishment, every claim of ownership passed through this open-air parliament. And on that day, the question before them was not land or cattle, but women. The wives of the fallen stood under guard near the boundary stones. They had been taken from battlefields, from burned farmsteads, from the wreckage of longhouses blackened by war. The victors claimed them by right, each man bringing witnesses to prove his kill. The losers' families, those who still lived, begged for the return of their daughters and sisters. The air vibrated with tension, not anger, but bureaucracy. Law, not mercy, ruled the north. At the centre stood law speaker Hrani, his cloak heavy with the weight of office. He spoke not for himself, but for the gods and for the order that bound men together. His staff struck the stone 3 times, calling silence. Then he recited the passage from the Gragas that all knew but few dared to speak aloud. A woman widowed by war is to be held as the property of the man who slew her husband, if his claim be made within 3 nights. The crowd murmured assent. One man stepped forward, Bjorn Ironhand, his tunic still marked with the blood of his rival. He claimed Sigrun, the widow of the man he had slain at sea. Her brother protested, offering silver for her release, but Hrani waved him down. The offer was unlawful. Only the killer's claim could stand. The assembly watched as Bjorn spoke the ritual words, hand upon the hilt of his sword. The woman's fate was sealed with his breath. When the judgment ended, the crowd dispersed. Some went to trade, others to feast, but Hrani lingered, gazing at the black cliffs rising over the plain. He had recited the law flawlessly, as his predecessors had for centuries. Yet beneath the echo of his own voice, he thought he heard something else, the faint crack of stone, like the earth itself protesting. He knew that every woman, taken under the Althing's judgment, was another link in a chain stretching across generations. That night, as the campfires flickered, Sigrun sat beside her new master. She stared into the flames, unblinking, her hands resting on her lap as though carved from wood. Around her, men laughed and drank, celebrating the justice of their ancestors. The wind shifted through the valley, carrying the smoke eastward toward the sea. There, it would mingle with the salt air and vanish like the names of the women whose fates had just been decided beneath the indifferent sky. The fjord froze early that year. The longships lay trapped in ice like beetles in amber, their dragon heads staring blindly toward a sun that never rose above the mountains. Inside the longhouses, men prepared for the season of darkness, sealing gaps with moss, slaughtering cattle, brewing ale that would last until thaw. The fires burned all day, and the smoke thickened the rafters like fog. In that confined world of hunger and heat, the living rearranged themselves according to survival. And survival, in the law of the North, meant the joining of households. The feast for the dead came first. The warriors who had fallen in summer raids were honoured with toasts, their names shouted until the timbers shook. But when the cups were emptied and the flames dimmed, a second ritual began: the selection of widows. The women of the slain sat apart, wrapped in black wool, their hair unbound. The warlord, Jarl Eirik of Hordaland, rose from the high seat and looked among them. His hall smelled of mead and pine tar, the air close and heavy with expectation. Every eye followed his hand as he gestured, choosing by rank, beauty, and age. Those selected were led forward. There were no priests, no vows of love or oaths of loyalty, only a declaration before witnesses that a woman now belonged to her husband's killer or ally. Each pairing was confirmed with a cup of ale, the same drink used to seal trade agreements. The Norse called it brúðlaup, the marriage feast, but there was no music, no laughter from the brides. Their faces remained blank, as if carved from the same wood as the benches they sat upon. Outside, snow began to fall, muffling the sound of the sea. The widows were taken to the men's sleeping quarters, their shadows long against the flickering firelight. For the warriors, this was law made flesh, the reordering of the world after chaos. To leave a widow unclaimed was to tempt misfortune. The gods punished imbalance as surely as they punished cowardice. And so, before the dawn, every woman had a new place in the hall, and every man a new token of power. Weeks later, when the storms closed the fjord and no ships could leave, the cries of newborns mingled with the crackle of the hearth. The first children conceived after that night were called vetraborn, winterborn, said to inherit both the strength of the slain and the ferocity of the survivors. The sagas would later praise them as the fiercest of their kind, warriors without fear or pity. But the women who bore them carried another memory, the sound of chains falling from the rafters as the snow buried the world outside. By spring, the fjord thawed and the ships sailed again. The men carried new wives aboard as if carrying heirlooms. Behind them, the old smoke lingered in the longhouses, a quiet witness to the marriages that began not with love, but with conquest. The tide crept up the river Liffey with a sound like slow breathing. The wooden piers of Dublin groaned beneath the weight of men, barrels, and chains. The Norse traders called this place Dyflin, their jewel in the west, where silver and flesh changed hands under the same law. The morning fog never fully lifted. It clung to the masts and shrouded the faces of those waiting to be sold. Ships from Norway and the Hebrides swayed beside the quays, their hulls heavy with plunder and captives taken from Ireland's burned monasteries. The traders were already at work before the sun broke. They wore fine wool and gilded brooches, their hands stained with ink from marking tallies on wooden boards. Behind them, the captives stood in rows women, mostly, their wrists bound with twisted rope. The warriors who had brought them in waited for payment. Their share of silver depended on youth and beauty, not on lineage. A wife of a slain nobleman fetched a higher price than 10 common servants. Even the scribes of Schleswig recorded such valuations, carved into runestones that read like market ledgers. 20 silver marks for a maiden unspoiled, 15 for a mother, 10 if wounded or defiant. Among them stood one woman whose gaze defied the buyers, a farmer's widow from Meath named Sif. Her husband had died defending their hall, cut down by the same men who now bartered for her. She bore the marks of rope on her skin, but her eyes held the cold clarity of someone beyond fear. A trader examined her teeth, her hands, even the shape of her shoulders, then nodded to the clerk. A line of runes was cut beside her name. Vendra, sold eastward. That single word sealed her fate. By midday, the wharf was thick with sound coins clinking, slaves crying, merchants shouting in a blend of Norse, Irish, and Arabic. The air reeked of fish and sweat, a market of misery disguised as commerce. Captives destined for the north were branded on the wrist. Those bound for the east carried wooden tags etched with their price. Some would end in Icelandic farmsteads, others in the harems of the Volga Bulgars. None would see their homeland again. When the day ended, the traders washed the blood from the boards and tossed salt onto the stains. The Vikings prided themselves on order, even their cruelty was methodical. In the taverns, they toasted the gods for good profit, lifting their cups over the same river that had carried holy relics days before. The slaves slept in pens, built from ship timbers, guarded by men with axes. Through the cracks of their enclosures, they could see the torches flickering along the quay, each flame a reminder of how wealth was born from conquest. The river whispered against the stones, a sound soft enough to be mistaken for prayer, but it was not mercy that ruled here. It was arithmetic, the cold mathematics of empire, written in blood and silver. At Port Marrick, the monastery stood like a ghost of peace on the edge of the sea. Its bell had rung for the last time 3 days before, silenced not by age or rust, but by the strike of an axe. Smoke still curled from the blackened rafters, drifting toward the grey horizon where the raiders' ships had vanished. The chronicles that survived would tell of slaughter 47 monks dead, defending their altar, yet not one word about the women left behind. That silence, centuries later, would say more than ink ever could. When the Norse came, they came with discipline. Their raids were not chaos but craft, measured like trade routes and timed with the tides. The monks died quickly, but the women of the settlement were taken methodically, first gathered, then divided, then judged. The youngest were claimed as spoils. The rest were left behind in the cold stone cloisters, locked without food until the ships sailed. The victors believed they were cleansing the land, carrying away what they called living silver. Archaeologists found them centuries later, beneath layers of bog and peat. 23 female skeletons, all buried shallow, all bearing the same injuries: blunt trauma to the back of the skull, shattered ribs, and forearms broken from defense. None were battlefield wounds. They were executions, carried out after surrender. Soil analysis placed their deaths within 3 days of the raid. The Vikings had stayed long enough to choose. The men took the youngest for trade. The rest they killed deliberately. The site told its own story. Fragments of rosaries mixed with shards of drinking horns, scorched manuscripts trampled into the mud beside bone. The bog preserved everything, even the shape of a hand still clutching a wooden cross. The priests who had taught mercy now lay alongside the women they could not protect. No chronicler dared record what those corpses testified that faith, too, could be looted. Among the remains lay the small, iron ring of a nun named Brigid. Her order's records end abruptly in that same year, her name followed by the Latin word desiderata, missing. But in the soil of Port Marrick, her story endured. She had not fled, nor begged, nor surrendered. The cut on her skull matched the angle of her own knife, suggesting she had turned it upon herself rather than be taken. The raiders had buried her with the others anyway, face down. When modern scholars unearthed the site, they stood in silence, listening to the marsh wind whistle through the reeds. It sounded like distant chanting. They could almost hear the bell again, not a call to prayer this time, but a dirge for the nameless dead. Port Marrick's ruins remain untouched, fenced off by the state. Locals say no birds nest there, and no sound carries after dusk. Perhaps the land remembers what the monks did not write. The silence itself became the only witness left. The royal hall at Reading had once been a place of gold and song. Saxon kings had feasted there, poets had sung of victories, and prayers had risen through carved beams thick with incense. But when the great heathen army came in the winter of 871, no melody survived. The palace was taken not by storm, but by hunger. The garrison starved, the walls surrendered, and the Danes entered without mercy. The chroniclers wrote of a king's defeat and a town's fall, but of the women within the hall they wrote nothing. Their silence was not ignorance, it was shame. When the raiders lit their fires, the tapestries curled and fell, carrying the painted faces of saints into ash. In the great chamber, the women of the royal household were gathered wives, daughters, and attendants of noble birth. They knelt beside the long table where their husbands had once made oaths. The Norsemen walked among them with torches and iron-tipped spears, deciding who would live and who would be taken. To the invaders, this was inheritance. The fallen king's bloodline, once proud, was now a prize to be divided. Excavations, centuries later, uncovered the truth the scribes could not. Beneath the stone floor, lay a layer of soot, dense and black, mixed with beads of melted glass from window panels. Among them, archaeologists found hairpins of Saxon make and a child's bronze bracelet bent by fire. Chemical traces revealed human fat soaked into the foundation, evidence of bodies burned inside the hall. This was no battlefield cremation, it was punishment. A single iron buckle found beside the hearth bore an engraving, a cross intertwined with a serpent. Scholars believe it belonged to Queen Ethelwyn, wife of the king's brother. No record of her survival exists, though her ring was later found in a Viking hoard buried near the Thames. Perhaps she was taken, perhaps she burned with her kin. Either fate would have suited the victors, for both erased her claim to royal blood. After the fires cooled, the Danes rebuilt the palace into a fortress. They slept on the same stones that had cracked under the heat of the flames. The women who remained served as thralls, cooking and mending for the men who had destroyed their world. They spoke little. To speak was to remember, and remembrance could drive a person mad. Years later, when Alfred's men retook Reading, they found the place unrecognizable, blackened beams, bones sealed beneath the flagstones, and strange carvings on the lintels. Norse runes scratched alongside Christian crosses, as if the two faiths wrestled for the same space. The scribes called the site cursed and refused to write of it again. Yet the stones of the palace still bleed rust after rain, and locals swear the ground there smells faintly of smoke. Whether by fire or by silence, the past refuses burial. On the banks of the Volga, far from the fjords and frozen fields of the north, the sky turned red with smoke. There, the Norse traders called Russ by the locals built pyres taller than houses. To the east they were merchants, to the west marauders, but in death they returned to the same fire. It was here, among the burial mounds of foreign kings, that the slave women of fallen warriors met their own final fate. When a Viking died in battle, his wealth went to the flames, his weapons, his horses, his hounds, and, often, the women bound to him. To the living, this was no cruelty, but duty. Death demanded balance, and a man's journey to Valhalla required companions. Without them, the gods might see his afterlife as incomplete. The slave girl chosen for the ritual was not asked, she was selected. She would die, so her master would not walk alone. The Arab chronicler Ahmad ibn Fadlan recorded such a scene in the year 921. He wrote of a chieftain's funeral on the riverbank, where a young slave volunteered or was convinced to accompany her lord into the afterlife. The days before the burning were filled with ritual. She was dressed in fine linen, made to drink intoxicating brews, and carried from tent to tent, where the men of the household took turns with her in the name of farewell. By the end, she no longer spoke in words, only murmured songs none could understand. The archaeologists, who later uncovered similar boat burials, found evidence that confirmed Fadlan's account. Female skeletons lay beside warriors, their bones showing signs of strangulation, knife cuts, and crushed throats. Around them, henbane seeds and fragments of belladonna hallucinogens had been scattered. The poisons dulled fear, inducing visions before death. The killings were deliberate, choreographed offerings to the gods. The women went to their end, believing they followed their masters into eternity. Their bodies arranged like living ornaments, for the wife there dead. In one burial mound near Uppsala, a girl's remains were found, with a woven garland still clinging to her skull. She had been placed beside a man's body, their hands bound together with braided flax. Her spine was broken. The blade that killed her was left in the grave, still upright, as if to anchor her soul. The people who buried her saw this not as murder, but as faith, the keeping of cosmic order. When the flames rose, the crowd would chant to Odin and Freya, their voices carried by the wind until only the crackling of the pyre remained. The air filled with the scent of pitch, resin, and burning flesh. They believed the smoke carried the dead to the gods, and, in that rising black column, the women disappeared nameless, voiceless, but essential to the glory of the man they followed. The ritual of fire was the final law of the warrior's wife, to burn so he could shine. In the northern fjords, where the sea froze in winter and the sun barely climbed the horizon, death was a ceremony written in smoke. When a warrior of renown died, his hall became a temple, and his bed became his bier. But what the sagas called honour often hid terror, for when a great man's breath ceased, it was the women who followed him into silence. The preparations began at dusk. The body of the fallen was washed and anointed with pine tar and myrrh brought from distant traders. His weapons were laid beside him, axe, sword, shield, and the proof of his worth. But to complete the ritual, the living were needed. Among his slaves, one would be chosen to accompany him, a bride of death. She was offered mead, comforted by the others, and told that joy awaited beyond the flames. Some accepted, dulled by the weight of their chains and the promise of release. Others resisted. For them, the rope waited. In a burial mound near Birka, archaeologists unearthed 2 skeletons, one male, one female, placed side by side. The man's bones bore the traces of disease, but the woman's neck showed the unmistakable groove of strangulation. Around her, fragments of ceramic bowls still held the residue of henbane and hemlock, poison first, then rope mercy in measured stages. The mixture would have blurred her vision, slowed her heart, and filled her mind with the shimmering illusions the priests called the dream path. When she could no longer stand, she was led to the bier. The priestesses, often older women who had witnessed many such rituals, carried out the act with precision. One looped the rope, another tightened it, and a third whispered prayers to Freya. The girl's body was then arranged beside the warrior, her head turned toward his, their fingers lightly touching. To the witnesses, this was a marriage, sanctified by fire. To the gods, it was an offering. The fires of these funerals burned for hours, devouring everything but the bones. When the ashes cooled, the survivors sifted through them, searching for metal. Brooches and pins were collected, melted, and reused in new ornaments relics that carried both beauty and horror. To wear such an heirloom was to wear the memory of sacrifice. A single verse from an old Norse skald captures the cruelty behind the devotion. She followed him through smoke to the sun's hall, her breath the last wind that carried his name. Centuries later, the grave goods would tell the same story: poisons, ropes, and bones arranged with unbearable care. These were not crimes in their eyes, but duty, performed without remorse, repeated across generations. In that world, love ended not with mourning but with ritual. The women who died by poison and rope were never seen as victims. They were seen as bridges, flesh turned to flame, binding life to death. And so, when the fires dimmed, their ashes mingled, indistinguishable, as if the gods themselves could no longer tell which had lived and which had burned. In the lowlands of Ireland, where the mist rolls thick across the marshes, the earth hides what the chronicles would not name. Centuries after the Norse had come and gone, farmers cutting peat uncovered bones too many, too close together, too deliberate. The bog had preserved them perfectly. Skin turned to leather, hair still clinging to skulls, clothing intact down to the stitch. The land had become a graveyard of secrets. Archaeologists would later count 23 bodies, all women, all buried without ceremony. The pattern was unmistakable: wrists bound, skulls fractured from behind, ribs broken from repeated blows. They had not died in the chaos of battle, they had died afterward, when the shouting stopped and the victors decided what to do with what remained. The soil's acids had sealed the evidence, embalming horror beneath centuries of moss and rain. The site lay close to what had once been a monastery, burned during the summer raids of the 9th century. Written records described the deaths of monks, the looting of relics, but not the fate of the women who had taken refuge there. It was the bog that told their story instead. Their last moments had been slow wrists tied with sinew cords, faces pressed into the damp earth. Some skulls bore hair ornaments, others the faint marks of tonsure, suggesting they had been nuns. Faith had not saved them. One body, smaller than the rest, was that of a girl no older than 15. Around her neck lay a simple wooden cross, carved from yew, its surface darkened by centuries underground. She had been buried face down, a sign in Norse law of punishment for witches, thieves, and defiant slaves. Perhaps she had fought back. Perhaps she had screamed when others kept silent. Whatever the truth, the executioners had marked her as unworthy, even in death. Chemical analysis of the peat revealed another secret. Traces of ash and charcoal mixed into the soil, remnants of the fires that had once consumed the Jiche, the monastery above. It meant the killings had been deliberate, systematic, a cleansing after conquest. The Norse had burned the symbols of faith, then buried its followers beneath the same ground. When the bones were finally lifted into light, their colours shifted from brown to pale grey, as if the air itself was reclaiming them. Local workers refused to continue the excavation after nightfall, saying they heard whispers rising from the cut trenches. Some said the ground breathed. Others swore they saw mist form the shapes of veiled women, faces turned away. The bog had kept their silence for 1,000 years, but silence does not mean peace. Even now, when the wind moves across those fields, it carries a faint sweetness, peat smoke, mixed with decay. The farmers call it the ghost wind, a reminder that beneath every step lies a story buried, waiting for someone to listen. The bones beneath the bog still speak, but only to those willing to hear. In Viking lore, even grief had an expiration date. When a man fell in battle, his widow had 3 nights to mourn before she herself became a prize to be claimed. 3 nights, that was all the law allowed between loss and possession. If no man declared her as his within that span, the Althing could assign her to another. A warrior's death was final. His wife's fate was administrative. The Gragas Code, etched into memory long before it was ever written, was mercilessly precise. It did not ask if the woman wished to remarry. It did not mention consent. The rule existed to maintain order among warriors, to prevent fighting over women, to ensure that the wealth of the slain did not scatter. Even compassion was reduced to arithmetic. On the first night she wept. On the second she was watched. On the third she was property. In one account from the Icelandic sagas, a woman named Thora lost her husband during a feud between rival clans. His killer came to her farm before the dawn of the 3rd day. He brought witnesses and silver, not as a gesture of kindness, but to make the claim legal. She refused to speak, so he spoke for her, reciting her husband's name, his own deed, and his right by conquest. The witnesses nodded. The law was fulfilled. The next morning, Thora left her home as a wife reborn in servitude. Excavations near Thingvellir have uncovered relics that confirm this ritual. In one burial mound, 2 skeletons, male and female, were found, positioned side by side, yet separated by a line of small stones. The man's weapons rested on his chest. The woman's wrists bore faint iron stains. Isotope analysis showed that she had been buried days after him, perhaps within that legal window. Her fate, like so many others, had been sealed not by love, but by schedule. To the Vikings, these customs preserved harmony. To defy them was to defy the gods themselves. A widow who refused her new husband could be accused of neath, dishonour, a moral sickness that threatened the community. Punishment ranged from flogging to exile. Most accepted the inevitable. A few vanished into the wilderness, becoming ghosts in the sagas, nameless women who refused to yield to the clock of the dead. In the far north, winter amplified every cruelty. The snow buried the graves of husbands and the footsteps of those who came to claim their wives. Fires burned in longhouses, where new marriages were forged before the old beds had even cooled. Men raised cups to their ancestors, thanking them for order. Outside, the widows learned that the gods of the north demanded obedience in every form, even in grief. 3 nights. That was the measure of a woman's freedom between one man's breath and another's hand. Beyond that, her silence was not sorrow, it was law. Along the windswept coast of the Danish peninsula, the market of Hedeby thrived under banners of red and blue cloth. Traders came from the east with amber and silk, from the south with Frankish wine, and from across the sea with cargo far more valuable than gold. They called it the bride market, a polite term for the commerce of conquest. Beneath its orderly stalls and measured runes lay a truth too raw for the sagas. Here, the wives of the fallen were sold to rebuild the world the wars had broken. It was not a secret practice. The ledgers of Schleswig still bear runic marks, recording values beside the names of men. For a woman of youth, 20 pieces of silver. For one who has borne a child, 15. For the wounded, 10. These were not poetic exaggerations, but receipts. The same stone tablets that list horses, cattle, and weapons list women in the same hand, the same neat lines. Traders haggled over lineage, strength, and health as though discussing livestock. The morning of the sale began with ritual precision. The women were washed in seawater, combed, and wrapped in woolen shawls. Buyers examined them in silence, their faces unreadable. Those recently widowed were marked by a cord tied around one wrist, a sign that they had belonged to a warrior slain in honourable combat. That cord made them more desirable, not less. To own what had once been another man's wife was to inherit his status, his luck, even his ghost. In the market centre stood an overseer named Cole, once a raider himself, now too crippled for war. He carried a staff engraved with the serpent of Jörmungandr, and spoke the law before each transaction. His words were plain. This woman was the property of the man who died by the sword. By the law of victory, she now passes to the man who pays. He did not look at the faces of those he sold. He had learned long ago that to look was to remember, and remembrance made trade difficult. Archaeologists have found remnants of this. Trade in the mud of Schleswig anklets worn smooth by rope, fragments of combs, and small lead weights used to measure silver. One set of scales bore a single engraving, Kona, meaning woman. It was as if the craftsman himself had accepted that humanity could be quantified. When the day ended, the merchants gathered in the taverns, counting profits while the longships waited in the harbour. Some of the women were sent north, to farms in Jutland, others east, along the Baltic routes toward Novgorod and Kiev. None returned. The fjord swallowed their reflections as the ships drifted from shore. The sagas remembered Hedeby for its trade, its prosperity, and its gods. They did not mention the women who built that wealth with their bodies. But in the damp soil beneath the market square, the bones of anklets still lie where they fell, testimony to a commerce that even time hesitates to forget. The winter of 873 froze the river Trent to silence. Across the white fields of Mercia, the banners of the great heathen army snapped in the wind like flayed skins. They had come to winter at Repton, a small riverside settlement with a monastery at its heart. The Saxon monks recorded the invasion briefly. The pagans came and took winter quarters. But the bones found, centuries later, revealed a far darker entry in the history of that frozen year. When the Danes made camp, they built not one settlement, but two, a fortress for the living and a grave for the dead. Timber palisades rose around the churchyard, enclosing hundreds of captives, priests, nuns, and wives of slain warriors from the surrounding lands. The Norsemen dug deep pits to store grain and weapons, and in the same earth they buried chains. Not the rusted loops of trade, but shackles forged for wrists and ankles, small enough to fit women. The iron still bears the scratches of desperate hands. The captives were sorted like cargo. Some were set aside for ransom, others kept as servants. A few were claimed under the old law of conquest widows of fallen warriors, now reassigned to their husbands' killers. The Danes justified it as order, a redistribution of fate. The chroniclers, perhaps fearing their own deaths, said nothing. Yet in the ground beneath Repton, the truth endured. When archaeologists unearthed the mass graves in the late 20th century, they found 249 bodies packed into a single chamber beneath the churchyard. 63 were women. Many bore fractures, some carried the marks of ligatures. The men had been arranged in ordered rows, as though in military burial. The women lay apart, tangled together, their bones showing no such care. Some had been decapitated, others bore signs of childbirth, their infants missing. The grave was not chaos, but ritualized neglect. Among the finds was a single chain, its iron links fused, together by corrosion. Inside, one of its loops was a fragment of bone from a young woman's wrist. Tests revealed she had come not from Mercia, but from Ireland, carried hundreds of miles as a captive. Her final rest was among the men who had enslaved her. The Danes stayed at Repton until the thaw. When spring came, they broke camp and moved east toward East Anglia, leaving behind their dead and the remains of their prisoners. The Saxons who returned found the land churned into mud, the monastery in ruins, and the church walls streaked with soot. But it was the ground that spoke loudest layers of ash, bones, and rusted iron, whispering the same story. The chains of Repton were never recorded in the sagas. They needed no words. Iron speaks plainly when it is pulled from the earth. It tells of men who mistook law for divinity, and women whose names the frost refused to keep. The wind off the North Sea bit through wool and skin alike, carrying with it the smell of pitch and tar from the ships at anchor. On the shore near Jorvik, a line of captives stood beneath a grey dawn. Their hair was matted, their clothes stiff with salt, but their eyes were awake, the kind of awake that comes when the body no longer dares to sleep. The raid had ended days ago. The victors were dividing what remained: silver, livestock, and souls. Among the prisoners was a woman called Alfhild, the widow of a fallen warrior. Her husband had died defending their hall, and his killer now stood before her, measuring her with the same indifference a man might show toward a hunting hound. His name was Orm, and he had already claimed 2 other women from the spoils. The law allowed it, the gods approved. But Alfhild, unlike the others, did not weep. She understood something the others did not, that sometimes survival required bargaining with monsters. Orm was no fool. He knew the worth of strength disguised as silence. "You would rather die," he said, his voice low. She met his gaze and replied evenly, "Only if you refuse to profit." The men around them laughed, but Orm did not. He saw the spark of cunning behind her calm. He could sell her, or he could use her. Both meant ownership. Only one promised advantage. He chose the latter. That night, while others drank, Alfhild sat near the fire, tending Orm's wounds from battle. She mixed herbs, whispered words her grandmother had taught her, and pressed them into his skin. He winced but said nothing. When he slept, she studied the scars on his back, the pattern of his tattoos, runes for protection, not for mercy. She memorized them. To know a man's runes was to know his fear. In the weeks that followed, she became indispensable. She kept the hearth, mended sails, and carried herself with the composure of a wife, though the title was never spoken. The others began to call her Orm's woman, as if it were a fact rather than a bargain. He did not correct them. She had traded her freedom for time, and time, in the age of steel and fire, was the rarest coin of all. Years later, her name appeared in a Danish record tablet found near Hedeby. It lists her as the owner of a small trading stall, Alfhild, keeper of goods from the west. How she earned that right is lost to history, but the mark beside her name is Orm's a co-signature, perhaps, or a memory. The scholars call it anomaly, an error in the document. Yet in the sagas, such women appear again and again, not as queens, not as slaves, but as survivors. The captives who died left bones. The ones who bargained left stories. And among the Norse, stories were the only currency that could outlast iron. In the long shadow of the Icelandic highlands, where the wind carried snow even in midsummer, the laws of the north ruled with the precision of a blade. When a warrior died, his possessions, his cattle, his weapons, his house, and his wife were not buried with him, they were claimed. The law called it Thrigja Nata Retur, the three-night right. After the third sunset following a man's death, his widow ceased to exist as her own person. She became inheritance. On the first night she was expected to mourn, the second to wait, the third to submit. If she refused, the community decided her fate. This was how peace was kept among men, through the measured transfer of grief. In one winter recorded by the sagas, a chieftain named Kori the Red was slain in a blood feud. His killer, Thorleif, arrived at Kori's farm before the third night's frost had settled. He came with 2 witnesses, as required by law, and a sword still stained with Kori's blood. The widow, Brynhild, sat by the hearth where her husband's body had been laid out. The smoke stung her eyes, but she did not cry. When Thorleif spoke the ritual words of claim her name, his deed, the god's witness, she rose and said only, "You may claim what you have earned." To the others, it sounded like surrender. To Thorleif, it was obedience. But in the months that followed, the household began to change. Brynhild did not shrink. She managed the farm as before, commanding the thralls, trading with the neighbours, keeping accounts. The men whispered that Thorleif had taken not a wife, but a ghost one, who obeyed the law but ignored the man. The Althing, that summer, heard complaints from Thorleif. He claimed she withheld his bed and refused to bear him heirs. The judges listened, but the letter of the law did not require affection, only acknowledgement of ownership. Brynhild had fulfilled that duty. When Thorleif returned home, he found her gone. Her footprints led into the mountains, where the law held no dominion. The sagas end her story there, though shepherds claimed to hear a woman's voice singing across the fjord in winters long after. Archaeologists uncovered a burial site near Thingvellir, containing the remains of a woman buried upright, a rare posture reserved for outlaws or oath-breakers. Yet among her bones lay a silver brooch of noble craft, and a fragment of woven linen finer than any thrall would own. Some believe it was Brynhild. If so, her escape was brief, but her defiance eternal. The three-night claim kept order in the north for generations, shaping the rhythm of grief and conquest alike. But every so often, a woman slipped between its hours, vanishing into the wilderness before the third night could fall. They became legends, proof that even in a world bound by law and steel, silence could still refuse to kneel. Long after the battles ended, and the raiders turned to farming, the old customs lingered inside the walls of every Norse household. A man's home was not just his dwelling, it was a shrine to his lineage. His wife, his thralls, even his animals existed as extensions of his soul, threads woven into the same fabric of fate. When he died, that fabric had to be cut cleanly. If it frayed, the dead might walk. And so the living performed rituals to bind the edges, rituals that demanded sacrifice. In the western fjords, a chieftain named Harek the Black was struck down by fever in midwinter. His hall was sealed for 3 days as the skalds composed verses for his burial. On the third day, the door was unbarred, and the smell of death poured out like a second breath. Inside, Harek's wives and thralls knelt beside his bier. His eldest wife, Freydis, had been given the honour of preparing his body, washing his limbs, braiding his hair, placing the coins beneath his tongue. The younger wives stood behind her, pale and trembling. They knew what came next. A man's household was buried with him, not metaphorically, but literally. His dogs, his horses, and sometimes his servants were slain to accompany him to the next world. But for wives, the decision rested with the kin. Harek's sons debated by the hearth who would go with their father to guard him in hell's cold fields. The law did not compel it, but the custom did. To deny a man companions in death was to invite his spirit's wrath. Freydis rose before dawn the next day, dressed in the white linen of the dead. She had made her choice without being asked. Her voice carried through the longhouse as she spoke to her sons. Your father's temper was a storm. Someone must follow him to calm it. They wept, but did not stop her. The other women were spared. Freydis walked to the burial mound alone, her hair loose, her hands empty. The priestesses greeted her in silence. They gave her mead laced with herbs, henbane, foxglove, and wild hemp, the same mixture used in sacrifices. Her last words, recorded by the skald, were simple. Keep the hall warm. Then she drank. When they opened her mound centuries later, her body lay beside Harrick's, her head turned toward his shoulder. The soil around her bones contained traces of poison strong enough to kill 10 men. She had died peacefully, perhaps even willingly. The archaeologists who examined her called it ritual suicide. The sagas called it devotion. The household of the dead was rebuilt every time a man fell, the living rearranged to mirror the afterlife. To refuse was rebellion against both gods and kin. Yet in quiet moments, the women left behind would whisper to the fire, praying that when their turn came, their sons would remember mercy. The dead demanded company. The living prayed not to be chosen. In the sagas, oaths were sacred spoken words bound tighter than iron. A man's honour depended not only on his courage in battle, but on the promises he could keep. Among those vows was one seldom sung of by skalds, the Ignar Either, the oath of ownership. It was a ritual by which a victor claimed all that had belonged to the man he had slain, including his wife. The sagas called it lawful. The gods, it was said, called it just. The ceremony took place before witnesses, often at the threshold of the longhouse. The killer placed his hand on the slain man's sword, raised it toward the roof beams, and swore by Odin's spear that he had taken life in honourable combat. The dead man's wife was then brought forward. Her wrists were unbound, her hair uncovered a mark that she stood between worlds, no longer wife, not yet thrall. The victor's next words were formulaic, learned by heart from elders and lawmen. By my deed, I take her as mine, as I took his life. Let the gods and men here gathered bear witness. To the onlookers, it was justice. One man's end became another's inheritance. To the woman, it was a rewriting of fate in the time it took for breath to leave her lungs. Once the oath was spoken, resistance became blasphemy. She could neither flee nor refuse without cursing her husband's memory. For her to reject his killer was to insult the gods who governed victory. One fragment of the Laxdæla saga tells of a warrior named Ketil the Pale, who killed his rival, Arnbjorn, in a duel. He brought Arnbjorn's widow, Inga, before the law rock, and recited the ownership oath before 3 witnesses. The saga records that she stood silent while the wind tore her veil away. Later, she bore Ketil a son. In her old age, when asked about that night, she said only, "The gods see through blood clearer than men see through water." Scholars debate her meaning still, whether it was submission or accusation. Archaeological finds in Iceland confirm that such ceremonies were not legend alone. At Hofstadr, a burial mound contained 2 skeletons, a man buried with weapons and a woman beside him, her hands folded across her chest. Between them lay a sword broken deliberately in half, the blade resting on her side, the hilt on his. The fracture was symbolic, a single life split, then joined again through death. Around the grave were small stones marked with runes of witness 3 names, perhaps those who had heard the oath. The Norse saw no contradiction between law and violence. Their gods themselves were bound by oaths of loyalty and vengeance. What was sworn in blood could not be undone. The Ignar Either turned killing into order, marriage into conquest, and grief into ceremony. In that world, to survive was to be spoken for. Silence was not absence, it was the sound of the law being obeyed. In the harbours of the north, where the sea smoked beneath the morning mist, the longships were more than tools of war, they were engines of commerce, of faith, and of captivity. Each plank, each nail, each carved dragon head bore the memory of raids and return. But there was one voyage the sagas did not sing of, one no warrior boasted about by the fire, the Brúðskip, the ship of brides. It sailed after every great battle, carrying the spoils of conquest that did not glitter women taken from burned halls, widows of fallen warriors, captives sold by the handful. The Vikings did not see these ships as prisons. They called them caravans of peace, a grotesque irony that softened the truth. Peace, in the language of the North, meant redistribution, the passing of wealth, land, and flesh from the defeated to the victorious. One such voyage left Dublin in the year 877. Its cargo was not grain or timber, but 70 women bound for the colonies of the North Sea. The shipmaster, Bjorn Flatnose, kept meticulous records in runes carved along the gunwale. 20 of Eire, 20 of Alba, 30 of the Saxon shore. Those carvings were found centuries later, when the wreck was raised from a fjord near Bergen. Each line, each stroke, was a ledger of human lives. The women were kept below deck, where the air was thick with tar and salt. Shackled in pairs, they survived on dried fish and melted snow. The sailors above sang to drown out the sounds below. The youngest were promised to local jarls as tokens of alliance. Others were destined for markets in Hedeby or the Baltic ports. A few would end as concubines, some as labourers, most as ghosts swallowed by the sea. One survivor, whose name never reached the sagas, left behind a single relic, a bronze brooch found in her ribcage when the wreck was uncovered. The metal was bent, as though she had hidden it beneath her tongue, and swallowed it when the ship began to sink. The scholars who studied it called her the Silent Witness. Her death preserved the only evidence that the ship had carried women, not warriors. When the storm came, it tore the sail to. The heart of every Viking port was not its harbour, but its marketplace. Between the clang of blacksmiths' hammers and the cries of fishmongers lay the stalls that defined the age, the flesh markets. Hedeby, Birka, Dublin, Kaupang, and Staraya Ladoga all shared the same rhythm. The creak of scales, the jingle of silver, the shuffle of bound feet across wet planks. To the Norse, there was no contradiction in selling what they conquered. They saw the world as a ledger, and every raid required a balance. The market began before dawn. Ships arrived from Ireland and the Western Isles, their holds heavy with captives. The women were led ashore in silence, hands tied, eyes lowered against the cold light of morning. Traders examined them like they would examine timber, tapping bone, checking teeth, appraising health. A strong back was worth more than beauty. A young woman who could bear children fetched the highest price of all. The scribes who recorded these exchanges used no euphemism. In the ledgers of Hedeby, the word Kona woman appears beside numbers that marked her value in silver. One account, carved into a runestone fragment discovered near Schleswig, reads, "Eirik sold 3 from the west, 1 from Alba, 1 with child." That last line has puzzled scholars. To note pregnancy as detail means it affected price. A pregnant captive was worth less, not because she was pitied, but because the unborn child was seen as damaged property, a mingling of blood outside lineage. The Vikings traded in lives, but they accounted for them as goods. In Dublin, where the Norse kings ruled for over a century, entire warehouses were built to hold captives before sale. Excavations have uncovered stone channels running along the floors, drains not for rainwater, but for waste. The walls were carved with tally marks, likely scratched by guards counting days or heads. The stones are worn smooth, where chains once rubbed against them. Here, wives of fallen warriors waited beside servants, all indistinguishable in the dim torchlight. Every few weeks, ships from the east arrived to buy. Slavic and Arab merchants came with glass beads and silver dirhams. The women were loaded like cargo and shipped downriver through Novgorod, Kiev, and into the markets of Byzantium and Baghdad. Some would serve noble houses, others would vanish into harems. The Norse called this trade menskipti, the exchange of men. In truth, it was the exchange of worlds. When evening fell, and the stalls emptied, the ground reeked of iron and sweat. Coins clinked in purses, while priests blessed the sails, their words rising above the cries that echoed between the timbers. For the traders, it was just business. For the captives, it was erasure. Centuries later, when the archaeologists brushed the mud from those same stones, they found the faint outline of a handprint pressed into the mortar, small, slender, and deep. A woman's last gesture, preserved in stone. Her name was never written, but her mark remains silent proof of the market's true cost. The storm struck without warning. It rolled out of the northern sea like a living thing, a wall of wind that tore sails to ribbons and drove longships into each other with the force of hammers. The men on deck screamed prayers to Thor, their voices lost in the roar of water. The women chained below never heard them. They were the cargo, packed in the dark belly of the ship, bound for the markets of the Baltic. To the raiders who had captured them, they were worth a fortune in silver. To the sea, they were nothing at all. One of the ships was called Hrafnild's Mercy, a name that mocked the fate of those it carried. Its hull was wide-bellied, built to hold 80 captives beneath deck. The iron rings were bolted to the ribs of the vessel, the chains long enough for sitting but not for standing. Each link was counted before departure, each woman's wrist checked to ensure she could not slip free. It was said that the ship had never lost a voyage until that night. The storm rose from the west, where the gods kept their tempers. Lightning cracked across the black sky, and the mast shuddered like bone. The captain ordered the hatches sealed. Inside the hold, the air turned thick with panic and salt. The women could hear the waves hammering the planks above them, could feel the floor tilt beneath their knees. Some prayed in languages the crew did not understand. Others clawed at the walls until their fingers bled. When the hull split, it did so quietly, a deep groaning sound, like wood sighing after too much weight. Water rushed in, the torches sputtered and died. The ship's crew cut the chains, not from mercy but desperation, trying to save the weight of the living. Those freed reached for the surface, but their limbs were heavy, their lungs already full of the sea. The captain leapt into the dark, clutching the purse of silver meant for their sail. Both he and his profits sank together. Centuries later, the wreck was found off the coast of Skagerrak, lying on its side like a wound in the seabed. Divers uncovered the remains of the captives, their bones scattered but still bound in pairs by rusted chain. Bronze clasps, hairpins, and amber beads marked them as women of rank wives and daughters, not slaves by birth. In one skull, a small bronze coin had been placed in the mouth, payment, perhaps, to cross into whatever afterlife could forgive the sea. Historians named the site the drowned cargo, a phrase that sounds almost gentle until you see the bones yourself. The ship had not sunk instantly. It drifted half a league before breaking apart. For hours, the sea would have been full of cries, the waves carrying them toward a shore that never answered. The traders of the north built empires on voyages like this, but the ocean, impartial and endless, recorded them all. Beneath its silence lies a ledger of its own, one written not in ink, but in salt, bone, and rust. When the Norse settled in the old Roman city of York, they renamed it Jorvik, a new capital for a new kind of empire. The city's streets were lined with wooden stalls and the stench of tanneries, but beneath its surface, something darker thrived. Beneath the timber halls, archaeologists would later uncover stone chambers with narrow cells, iron rings fixed into the walls, and gutters cut into the floor for drainage. These were not prisons. They were breeding halls. The records of the 11th century called them barnhus child houses. Their purpose was not to hold captives, but to multiply them. A woman of the conquered lands could bear strong offspring, half Norse, and these children were valuable, trained as servants, soldiers, or concubines. In the ledgers of Jorvik's merchants, women were listed by age and fertility, not by name. The trade in flesh had evolved from capture to production. One hall, uncovered beneath Coppergate in modern excavations, contained 64 cells, each no larger than a grave. Soil analysis showed repeated habitation layer upon layer of waste, ashes, and bone. The women were kept in rotation. When one was pregnant, another replaced her. Infants were recorded in church baptismal rolls as foundlings, marked Father Unknown. The same churches received silver from the men who ran the halls. Faith became the clerk of sin. The chronicles are silent, but the ground is not. In the drainage channels, archaeologists found traces of milk and blood mixed with soot from cooking fires. The walls bore scratches where chains had rubbed against stone. One inscription, carved in Latin by an unknown hand, read Non est vita, sed poena. This is not life but punishment. It was scratched deep, as if the writer meant to carve through time itself. Among the bones were small trinkets, a child's tooth pendant, a wooden toy horse, and a spindle whorl engraved with the symbol of Freya, goddess of fertility. Perhaps one of the women clung to the goddess as both comfort and curse. Freya was said to take half of the dead from battlefields. Maybe, in their prayers, these women hoped she would take them too. When the Normans later conquered England, they found the system too efficient to destroy. They simply adopted it. The church continued the record-keeping. The trade shifted to new masters, and the breeding halls of Jorvik were walled over, buried beneath cobblestone and time. Even now, beneath the modern streets, the smell of damp earth and iron lingers. Tourists walk above, never knowing that their footsteps echo over the remnants of chambers where history was not written but birthed in chains. The Norse believed their gods demanded fertility as proof of favour, but in Jorvik, fertility became captivity. The children born there carried the future of the empire and the silence of those who had no choice in creating it. In the north, every life began beside a fire, a cradle carved from pine, lined with wool, and set close to the hearth where smoke whispered blessings to the gods. But for many of the women taken in raids, that cradle was not a symbol of hope. It was a reminder of captivity. Their children, born of conquerors, belonged not to them, but to the households that claimed them. Viking law was clear. The offspring of a slave mother inherited her status, not the father's. Flesh begot flesh, property begot property. In the settlements around the Humber and Repton, skeletal remains tell this story better than any saga. Infant bones found buried in shallow pits bear the unmistakable signs of deliberate death. Skulls fractured cleanly, ribs unbroken, no marks of disease. Archaeologists who studied them found no evidence of burial rites. They were not mourned, they were erased. The chroniclers of the time, writing in careful Latin, avoided the subject entirely. But in one marginal note from an English monastery, a monk recorded a single chilling phrase: "They killed the babes of the conquered, lest the seed grow wild." To the Norse, this was not cruelty, it was logic. A child born to a captive woman could not inherit land or name, but could challenge legitimacy. Better to end the line than to risk a claim. Those allowed to live were baptized and sold, their mothers dismissed or buried in the same soil as their stillborns. In the ash layers of Viking Age homes, residues of lead and mercury have been detected elements from herbal concoctions once used as abortifacients. The evidence suggests that women sometimes took matters into their own hands, choosing to end what had been forced upon them. One such case was uncovered near York, a grave containing a young woman and a newborn, both laced with traces of hemlock and yew. The positioning of the bodies told the story, the mother cradling the child, her face turned toward its hair. She had not been executed. She had made her own peace. In her bones, scientists found signs of malnutrition and healed fractures, proof of long servitude. Yet in her final act, she reclaimed control in the only way the gods had left her. The sagas never mention this, for sagas were written by men who celebrated birth as triumph. But somewhere between the lines of the Laxdæla saga and Ingjald's saga, the silence of the women speaks louder. The cradle was not always a blessing. It was sometimes a tomb disguised as mercy. When storms roll over the old Viking towns, rainwater seeps into those ancient graves and rises again through the soil. Locals say the puddles that form afterward have a bitter taste, metallic and strange. Perhaps it's only iron and decay, or perhaps, as the elders whisper, it is the taste of the poisoned cradle, the ghost of the milk that once carried both life and death. In the sagas, women are often praised for endurance, the patient wife, the grieving widow, the silent mother. But the earth beneath the Norse world tells a truer story, one carved not in verse but in bone. It is the story of women who gave birth in bondage, whose bodies became the battleground after the fighting had ended. Archaeologists call it trauma. The Vikings called it fate. At a burial site near Lincoln, a mass of female skeletons was found lying close together, some still curled around the small remains of infants. The soil analysis revealed high levels of copper, the trace of blood that had soaked the ground centuries ago. Each woman had died during or soon after childbirth. The pelvic fractures, torn spines, and twisted limbs bore silent witness to agony. Yet, what made the discovery most haunting was not their pain, but their pattern. These were not the wives of free men. Their isotopes showed origins far from England, Ireland, Wales, the northern coast of Francia. They had been captives brought to serve as mothers. To the Norse, fertility was a divine mandate. A woman's ability to bear children was the measure of her worth, and her death in childbirth was seen as noble, akin to a warrior's fall in battle. The Eddas even describe how women who died in labour might be received by Freya herself, the goddess of fertility and war. But the rituals that sanctified their suffering masked an economy of exploitation. The households of Jorvik and Repton relied on these women to expand their labour forces, to birth the next generation of servants and soldiers. When they died, their value was replaced, not mourned. One saga fragment, rarely quoted, tells of a thrall named Halla who served in the household of a sea king. When she bore his child and the babe died, she begged to be freed from his bed. Instead, he ordered her to nurse another's infant. She obeyed, but a month later, she drowned herself in the fjord. The saga praises her master's wisdom, not her courage. Such was the measure of mercy in those times. In a remote valley of western Norway, researchers uncovered another clue, a small stone marker inscribed with the runes "On blota med blóði sitt." She sacrifices with her own blood. The phrase has puzzled historians. Was it metaphor or confession? Perhaps it was both. When modern hands brushed the dirt from those graves, the bones of mothers and children lay intertwined, their stories fused forever. The Vikings saw in birth the cycle of their god's creation, born of violence, life bought by pain. But beneath that myth lay the unspoken truth. For many women, motherhood was not sanctity, but sentence. Even now, in the museum where their bones rest under glass, visitors say they feel a heaviness in the air, as if the room itself remembers the sound of their last breaths, the hush that followed, and the wound that never healed. Just beyond the city walls of old Dublin lies a patch of ground the monks once called Terra Damnata, the damned earth. It was there, in the shadow of the Norse stronghold, that the punishment pits were dug. They were not graves at first. They were meant for teaching. Every Viking settlement had a place where law was made visible. Theft, rebellion, blasphemy, defiance, all found the same ending, the pit. The law codes describe it in plain terms. A slave who injured her master, a wife who struck her husband, or a captive who tried to flee could be jarðsettur, set into the ground. The phrase sounds peaceful, but the practice was anything but. The condemned were placed into narrow shafts, cut into the soil, too deep to climb out and too small to lie down. Their legs were often broken first to prevent escape. The pit would then be covered loosely with planks, leaving space for air, but not light. Death came by thirst, exposure, or madness. Archaeologists found one such site during an excavation in the early 2000s. The pits were stone-lined, 6 feet deep, 3 wide, each containing the bones of 1 or 2 individuals. The pattern was deliberate. The women's arms were fractured, their fingers clawed against the rock. Some pits held standing water, others sharp stones. A few contained iron shackles that had fused to the bone. Radiocarbon dating placed them squarely in the 9th century, the height of Viking Dublin's slave trade. The soil told the rest. Around the pits were signs of human presence, footprints, food remains, fragments of pottery. The pits had not been hidden. They were part of daily life. Some were even located near the market square. Punishment was not only retribution, it was spectacle. Captives awaiting sale would be brought to witness to learn what disobedience cost. Those buried alive became warnings. Their suffering was currency for order. One pit held something different, a flat stone slab with runes carved along its edge. They read, "She bit her master's hand." Below the inscription, the remains of a woman were found, her jaw dislocated, her teeth shattered. Whoever she was, her defiance was immortalized, not through mercy but through record. The carver wanted her story to last. It did. In Norse cosmology, the underworld was ruled by Hel, the goddess who accepted the dishonored dead. To the Vikings, placing the rebellious into the earth alive was a fitting, offering the living sent directly to the realm of the silent. When modern visitors stand on that site, the wind seems to move oddly. It rushes up from the ground rather than across it, as if the land still breathes. The monks once refused to consecrate the soil, calling it cursed. Perhaps they were right. The pits of punishment still hold the echo of muffled voices, reminders that even in an age of gods and law, cruelty required no justification beyond example. In the Viking world, every crime had a punishment, every insult a price, and every woman a place. But there was one law that held all others in its shadow, the law that forbade her to speak. The Thegjandi Kona, the silent woman, was not just an expectation, it was doctrine. Silence was a virtue, a shield, and a cage. When the sagas were finally written, they praised women for wisdom, for patience, for loyalty, but never for their voices. The Gragas law codes described this unwritten rule with chilling precision. If a woman accused a man of wrongdoing without a male witness, her word was void. If she spoke against her husband before the assembly, she could be flogged for dishonor. Even in matters of blood feud, her testimony was considered worth half that of a man's. To speak out of turn, the law said, was to disturb the order of the hall, and disorder was sin. In settlements like Hedeby and Repton, archaeologists have uncovered wooden tablets covered with carved runes, fragments of personal records, prayers, and sometimes confessions. One such tablet, found near a woman's grave, bore a short inscription, "I spoke, I was beaten." Beneath those words was a single carved symbol, the Bindrun for truth. She had preserved her defiance not in voice, but in wood. Silence was enforced not only by law, but by ritual. When a woman was claimed as a wife or thrall, she was expected to remain mute during the ceremony. To speak was to reject the god's decision. Those who resisted were branded as witches Seith Kona, accused of speaking spells that bent men's wills. The punishment for such sorcery was either drowning or exile, and both ended the same way, disappearance. The women who vanished left no graves, only absences marked by superstition. One saga tells of Astrid of Hordaland, a widow who refused to stay silent after her husband's killer claimed her under the law of victory. She stood at the Althing and shouted her defiance before all. Witnesses said her voice carried over the crowd like thunder. The next day, she was found hanging from a tree near the assembly. The chroniclers called it suicide. The law called it balance restored. Even within their homes, women learned to speak in gestures. A shared glance across the hearth, a carved pattern on a spindle, a song hummed too softly to be noticed. These became their languages. Their silence was not emptiness, it was survival. Today, scholars debate whether the Thegjandi Kona was a social invention or divine command. The runes say neither. They show that silence became inheritance, passed down like heirloom jewelry, shaped by fear and necessity. The women of the Viking Age did not lose their voices. They buried them deep beneath words men could not hear. And sometimes, when wind moves through the old fjord valleys just right, it sounds like whispering. Perhaps it is the same silence, still refusing to fade. In the Viking world, memory was law. What was not witnessed did not exist, and what was not spoken aloud was as good as never done. The Norse had no written courts, no royal decrees. They had stones grey, unyielding, eternal. The Vitni Steinar, or witness stones, stood across the north like frozen echoes, marking where oaths were sworn, crimes judged, and lives claimed. Every act of ownership, marriage, or vengeance was sealed before them. They were the silent jurors of a civilization built on blood and breath. When a warrior claimed a fallen man's wife as his own, he did so before such stones. 3 men stood as witnesses, each laying a hand upon the cold surface, while the claimant recited the ritual. By sword and by victory I take what is his. The woman stood nearby, her fate carved into air, the stones absorbing it. Later, the runemaster would chisel the event into permanence, not the woman's name, but the act itself. Hundreds of these inscriptions survive. Eirik took the land and the woman of Hrothgar and built this stone. A lifetime reduced to property and grammar, the stones themselves became archives of cruelty, disguised as custom. At Jelling, beneath the great mound of the Danish kings, archaeologists found fragments of limestone bearing faint scratches beneath the royal runes, secondary inscriptions carved by other hands. One reads, "She wept here." Another, "They made me watch." The official carvings spoke of conquest. The hidden ones whispered of consequence. Over time, these witness stones spread across Scandinavia and the conquered isles. Each marked a place where law had replaced mercy. Villagers avoided them at night, believing that those bound by oath beneath their shadows could not rest in death. Legends claimed that on certain midsummer nights, blood seeped from their cracks. Priests in later centuries, when Christianity took hold, tried to sanctify them, chiseling crosses into the surfaces, but the stones outlasted every conversion. They remained what they had always been, the record keepers of dominion. In one coastal valley of Norway, a standing stone was unearthed during roadwork in the late 19th century. Beneath its base lay 2 skeletons, one male, one female, buried upright. The man's skull had been crushed. The woman's wrists bore marks of iron cuffs. The runes above them read simply, "He won her." The phrase was not boastful, merely factual, as if conquest required neither praise nor guilt. Modern scholars who study these stones describe them as history's contracts. Yet for the people who lived in their shadow, they were more than documents, they were oracles. To touch one was to feel the weight of generations. To defy one was to risk the gods' wrath. The witness stones still stand, scattered across fields and churchyards, their surfaces eroded by centuries of rain. Their inscriptions fade, but their silence endures a silence heavier than words, carved by those who believed that memory itself could be owned. From the fjords of Norway to the forests of Russia stretched a path of silver and suffering, known in the old tongues as Ostreviga, the Eastern Way. The sagas celebrate it as the trade route of heroes, where merchants carried furs and swords to the markets of the Rus. But beneath those tales of profit and glory lay another current, unspoken yet ever present, the road of the enslaved. It wound along rivers and through marshes, paved not with stone, but with the bones of those who walked it in chains. The journey began in the ports of Dublin, York, and Hedeby. There, captives taken from Ireland, Wales, and England were sorted like livestock. Those judged strong enough for travel were branded with runes of ownership, and marched eastward in long columns. The Vikings called them menneskevarninger, human goods. For every 10 that left the coast, 3 would die before reaching the next harbour. Hunger, cold, and exhaustion thinned them, but the trade continued, fueled by the endless demand of markets beyond the Baltic. Archaeological digs along this route reveal its human toll. At Staraya Ladoga, the oldest Norse settlement in Russia, excavators found shallow graves beside the riverbank, women buried with shackles still around their ankles. Their isotope readings trace origins as far as Ireland and northern France. Alongside them lay fragments of iron rings, animal bones, and dirhams, Islamic silver coins, that tell the other half of the story. The Norse were not merely raiders, they were middlemen in a global commerce of bodies. The eastern route was efficient, almost industrial. From the Gulf of Finland, ships sailed south down the Neva and Volkhov rivers through Lake Ilmen, then onto the Dnieper, 1,000 miles of waterway that connected the cold north to the glittering palaces of Byzantium. The ships carried furs, amber, and women. In the contracts of the Rus, preserved in Byzantine archives, slaves were listed by category: maidens of the north, wives of slain warriors, housekeepers of the Saxons. The words were polite, but the reality was not. Those who survived the voyage were brought to the markets of Novgorod and Kiev. There they were washed, combed, and displayed before foreign buyers. The prices fluctuated with the season, higher in spring, lower in winter when the rivers froze. A merchant's diary recovered near Kiev records that one woman from the islands was sold for 20 dirhams, for she was red of hair and unbroken. The entry ends with a single phrase: she would not speak. Centuries later, the route itself remains visible from the air. The faint curve of river valleys, the traces of camps, the scars of fire in the soil. Locals still find iron rings in their fields after the rain. Some hang them on trees for luck, others bury them again. They say it keeps the voices quiet. For on stormy nights, when wind follows the river, it carries with it the faint clatter of chains, the song of those who walked the slave road east and never returned. By the 10th century, the Dnieper River was the great artery of Norse ambition. Its waters flowed south through dense forests and endless steppe, carrying ships laden with amber, furs and iron, and always, beneath the tarred planks, human cargo. The Rus, descendants of Norse settlers who ruled the trade cities of the east, had turned Kiev into the beating heart of this grim commerce. The sagas called it Kenugartha, the city of many yards. To merchants, it was a miracle of wealth. To captives, it was hell with walls. The market stood near the Podil district, on the riverbank, where the air smelled of fish oil and smoke. Here, under awnings of woven flax, stood the pens. Each was built of oak beams sunk deep into the mud, wide enough to hold 20 souls. The merchants called them husfolk, house stock. Every week, new ships arrived from the north, carrying their human freight widows of fallen warriors from Ireland, daughters of Saxon nobles, Slavic villagers stolen from raids. The buyers came from as far as Persia and Byzantium, their silver coins stamped with unfamiliar faces. The trade followed a ritual order. At dawn, the captives were bathed in the river, their hair cut short, their wounds smeared with resin to hide infection. They were dressed in linen tunics provided by the traders. Not from mercy, but from marketing clean cloth, fetched higher prices. Each bore a mark on the wrist or neck, a rune, a brand, or a strip of dyed leather, indicating ownership. The auctioneer recited their origins as if chanting genealogy. Of the Irish coast, unwed. Of York, wife of the fallen. Of Pomerania, one child. Witness accounts survive in fragments. An Arabic merchant, Ahmad ibn Rusta, described these markets with both fascination and disgust. He wrote that the Norse traders were great in trade but cold in soul, that they valued a strong slave as they valued a fine blade. His words still sting with precision. Beneath his observation lies a deeper horror, the recognition that the women of the north had become a global currency. The ruins of the market tell their own truth. Excavations in Podil unearthed layers of burned soil mixed with shackles, scale weights, and thousands of broken beads. The beads had once been sewn onto clothing, given to captives as decoration tokens of temporary value. Charred bones show that when plague swept through the city, the sick were burned en masse, their remains tossed into the river to keep trade unspoiled. Yet even in that world of calculation, resistance flickered. One grave outside the market held a woman buried upright, her chains placed neatly beside her. In her clenched hand, she held a coin with its face defaced, a scratched-out emperor, erased deliberately. Perhaps she cursed the coin, or the system it represented. Perhaps it was her way of speaking when the law forbade her to. The merchants of Kiev called themselves bringers of civilization. The gods they prayed to demanded only profit, but the Dnieper still whispers differently. When the current runs high and the reeds bend low, it murmurs like voices counting not wealth, but names. When Harald Fairhair united Norway under his crown, the men who followed him boasted of order. They said the old chaos of clan wars and feuds was ended, that law now ruled the north. But order, like peace, had its price. It was paid not in coin or in cattle, but in women. The skalds called it blodgjald, the blood tax, a tribute of flesh offered to kings and jarls to seal allegiance and settle war debts. In the royal halls, such exchanges were spoken of with ceremony. The warrior who bent his knee to a stronger lord brought with him more than silver. He brought the wives and daughters of his slain enemies. Each was presented before the high seat as proof of loyalty, her silence of the mark of acceptance. The sagas romanticized these moments, describing them as gifts of union, the binding of houses through beauty. But beneath the golden verse, they were transactions in human suffering. The Icelandic Landnámabók records several such tributes in passing. One entry reads, Hrolf Ketilsson gave 2 Irish women to his jarl for peace. Another, a farmer from Hålogaland sent his brother's widow as payment for debt. The chroniclers wrote these lines without hesitation, as though listing shipments of grain. What mattered was not the woman's will, but the social balance her body maintained. At Avaldsnes, the archaeological seat of Fairhair's court, recent digs have uncovered evidence of these rituals. Beneath the church ruins, 21 female skeletons were found buried apart from any men, their graves aligned in perfect rows. DNA analysis revealed they were not of local descent, half carried Celtic markers, others from the Saxon coast. Around their necks lay fragments of glass beads, once bright and precious, now dulled by earth. None bore weapons or ornaments of rank. They were the physical proof of loyalty and surrender. The Norse lawmen saw no shame in this practice. The concept of honour demanded repayment for blood spilled, in feud or war. When silver could not suffice, lives were substituted. A wife of an enemy slain in battle equalled a dozen marks of silver. A daughter of noble blood could settle an entire dispute. To refuse to deliver such payment was to invite annihilation. Even the gods, they said, demanded balance. In one saga fragment, a chieftain's wife named Solveig was offered as blood tax to the king whose son her husband had killed. When she was taken, she spoke only once. I go not for peace, but to remind men what peace costs. The line survives, barely legible. On a later copy of the tale, a single ember of defiance, buried within legal prose. The blood tax endured for generations, long after Fairhair's death. It shaped alliances, carved kingdoms, and filled graves. To the poets, it was glory paid in lineage. To the women who bore it, it was the final toll of war. And when the winds sweep across Avaldsnes today, they pass over the graves like the faint sigh of debt still uncollected. When the Norsemen settled in the lands they once burned, they brought their gods with them, Odin, Thor, Freya, but they also took something from the conquered, the cross. At first it hung as plunder, gleaming on the necks of raiders like exotic charms. Later, as Christianity spread through the north, the cross became a new weapon not of war, but of control. For women, it changed nothing. The chains merely altered shape. In the monasteries rebuilt after the raids, Christian scribes wrote of repentance and renewal. They spoke of Norse wives baptized beside their husbands, of heathen women redeemed by the mercy of the church. But the soil beneath those new chapels tells another story. At Repton, Whitby, and York, excavations have revealed mass graves of women bearing marks of violence dated decades after the conversions. Their killers, once calling on Odin, now invoked the name of Christ. The rituals of domination survived the fall of the old gods. They simply found a new priesthood to sanctify them. One fragment of a 12th century homily, preserved in Old Norse, warns men not to take the widow in sin, nor the captive by lust, lest your soul rot in hell. But even as priests preached virtue, royal charters recorded the transfer of women as property. The Domesday Book, written a century after Hastings, lists female dependents alongside cattle and grain. In the ledgers of abbeys, servant girls appear as line items, with taxes levied on their labour. The cross that promised redemption instead legitimised ownership. At Whitby Abbey, a carved stone cross discovered during restoration bears an image long misinterpreted. Scholars once believed it depicted Mary Magdalene kneeling at Christ's feet. Closer study revealed the figure was bound wrists tied behind her back, a rope around her neck. The scene below showed men with axes and ships in the background. The cross was not a symbol of mercy. It was a memorial to subjugation, perhaps even gratitude for conquest. As Christianity spread deeper into Scandinavia, priests rewrote the old laws but kept their spirit. Marriage remained a contract of possession, and forced unions were baptized instead of blessed by the gods. Women captured in raids were converted by marriage, their children raised as proof of piety. The sagas of this period speak of Christian wives given to Norse lords as spoils of victory. Faith became the new justification for the same old crimes. One grave near Trondheim preserves the transition in chilling detail. A woman buried with a wooden cross placed on her chest also bore the iron ring of a slave around her neck. The two symbols, salvation and servitude, rested side by side in the same soil. The missionaries saw triumph in such conversions. The earth saw continuity. The Vikings had learned to bend gods as they bent people. They no longer burned monasteries. They built them. And within those walls, the cross replaced the axe not to free, but to bind. When the wars quieted and the longships rested in their harbours, the north grew still, but the silence that followed was not peace. In villages from Rogaland to the Hebrides, the hearths burned low, their smoke curling through thatched roofs like sighs. Too many men had died abroad, too many women had vanished into conquest, and too few children were born to fill the empty halls. The chroniclers called it the thin generation. The skalds wrote that the gods had withdrawn their blessing. In truth, the barrenness was human-made, the echo of centuries of violence turned inward. Census records from later Christian scribes tell a strange story. Entire districts where women outnumbered men 3-1, yet births declined. The sagas describe wives growing old without children, their marriages cold and formal, as if fear itself had crept into the bed. For generations, the Norse had treated women as inheritance assets to be claimed, traded, or burned. Now that pattern began to devour its own world. Archaeologists excavating farmsteads along Norway's western fjords found traces of this collapse in the soil. Hearths had been rebuilt over and over, yet few children's bones appeared in the graves nearby. In some sites, the remains of infants were found buried beneath thresholds, offerings, perhaps, to rekindle fertility. Small wooden idols of Freya and Frigg lay shattered in refuse pits, as though the people had turned on their own gods. The land had not failed them. they had failed the balance that sustained it. One legend from the Orkneys tells of a woman named Svala, last of her line. Each spring she lit the family hearth with a coal carried from her mother's fire, whispering the same plea, "Let the flame take root." Yet the winters grew longer, and her womb remained empty. When she died, the neighbours sealed her house rather than rebuild it. They said the gods had taken her hearth as warning. The ruins still stand, stones blackened by soot, that never fades, no matter how much it rains. As Christianity spread, priests reinterpreted the barrenness as divine punishment, a reckoning for the sins of the heathen past. They called upon women to bear children for God's kingdom, turning motherhood into penance. But fertility is not commanded by decree, and faith could not erase fear. The daughters of slaves did not wish to bring more slaves into the world. The widows of conquest refused to fill halls that had once held chains. By the 11th century, the Norse population began to shift. Families grew smaller, villages shrank, and the hunger for war subsided. A society that had lived by taking had forgotten how to build. The old storytellers noticed. In one fading saga, a poet wrote, "The fires burn, yet no laughter answers them." The barren hearths of the north were not curses from the gods, nor plagues of the body. They were memory made visible, the final harvest of centuries, where women's bodies had been spent like coin, and now none remained to pay the price. Her name survives only in fragments: Gunhild, daughter of no one, wife of none. The Frankish chronicles call her the Norse Fury. To the sagas, she was a shadow who struck in the night, a blasphemy in human form. Yet long before she became legend, she was a captive. Gunhild's story began in Dublin, when the Norse still ruled the slave markets. She was said to have been taken from the coast of Brittany, a girl of 15, when her father's hall was burned. For 7 years she served in the house of a Viking trader, enduring the same quiet servitude that had swallowed thousands before her. But where others bent, she waited. In the 8th year, when her master sailed for Francia, she escaped in the chaos of a fire that consumed half the quay. Witnesses later swore they saw her cut her own collar ring with a shipwright's chisel. Freedom began with blood. She vanished into the forests of Neustria, where remnants of Frankish and Norse bands still skirmished along the rivers. By the time her name resurfaced in records, she commanded a small warband of freed slaves and deserters. The annals of St. Vas describe her raids with horror. A woman led them, tall and unflinching, who knew the ways of the Northmen better than they knew themselves. For 7 years she struck Viking outposts, ambushed slave caravans, and burned holding pens along the Seine. Archaeology lends weight to the legend. Burn layers at Rouen and Quentovic show the same pattern: storehouses torched, slave chains scattered, coins left untouched. Whoever led those attacks sought liberation, not loot. In one ruin, the charred remains of a longhouse revealed an inscription scrawled in ash on a fallen beam: "Not every wife waits to be taken." The Norse responded with brutality. Bounties were placed on her head in both Frankish and Norse lands, yet none caught her. In 930, a chronicler wrote that Gunhild raided the market at Ragn, killing 47 traders and unmanning their leader. The choice of words was deliberate. She had castrated him before burning his body. Her vengeance was methodical, almost ritual. And then, silence. After that final raid, her name disappears from record. Some say she was captured and executed by drowning, a fitting irony for one who had freed slaves from ships. Others whisper she sailed east with her followers, vanishing into the forests beyond the Volga. Whatever her fate, the marks she left remain carved into the rivers she once haunted. The church later tried to erase her, rewriting her deeds as cautionary tales. Yet among the women of coastal villages, her story endured in song. They sang not of her cruelty, but of her defiance. A woman who refused both masters and gods, who made her vengeance into prayer. In a world that prized silence, Gunhild spoke with fire. Her voice burned long after her body was gone, a reminder that even in the darkest age, resistance could leave its own kind of scripture. The raid began at dusk, when the sky over the River Seine glowed the colour of molten iron. The Norse merchants at Rang, a thriving slave market built beside the monastery's ruins, were preparing for their evening feast. Their pens were full, their ships heavy with silver. They had no reason to expect death from the river. But down the current came longboats without banners, their hulls painted black, their oars silent. At their prow stood a woman with a torch. Her name was Gunhild. The chronicles of the Frankish monks say the first flames rose from the livestock pens. The traders rushed to save their wares, not realizing until too late that the true target lay elsewhere. Gunhild and her followers stormed the marketplace, cutting through guards with the precision of veterans. The chains that once bound captives were torn from the posts and used against their masters. By night's end, 47 Norse merchants were dead, their throats opened, their ships set ablaze. The chronicler who recorded it called the event a cleansing by fire. Archaeologists later uncovered the ash. The layers told the story better than any pen could. Beneath the burned beams lay rows of iron shackles fused by heat, and among them the charred bones of women who had been freed but too weak to flee. The fire had consumed liberator and captive alike. Soil analysis found traces of tallow human fat, suggesting the blaze had burned hotter than ordinary wood. The site was not looted. Every coin, every silver weight remained where it had fallen. The destruction was not for profit, it was for memory. Those who escaped said Gunhild gave no mercy. She ordered the remaining traders castrated before execution, declaring it payment for the seed of the conquered. The act shocked both Christians and pagans alike, yet her name spread as both curse and legend. The sagas, written a century later, call her Hrafna Brúða, the Raven Bride, the woman who fed the gods with the blood of men. To her followers, she was more than a leader. She was vengeance, given voice. When the smoke cleared, Rang was gone. The market that had once processed hundreds of captives each season never recovered. Its docks rotted, its warehouses sank into the mud. The monks who later rebuilt the monastery said the ground refused to bear crops, the soil forever blackened by sin and salt. They planted a stone cross on the hill above the ruins, carved with a single prayer, "May the flames of wrath become the light of mercy." No one ever found Gunhild's body. Some believed she perished in the fire she had started. Others swore she escaped east, vanishing into the forests of the Russ. But every spring, when mist rises over the Seine, fishermen claim to see smoke drifting where the river bends not from their lamps, but from something older, drifting just above the water. They call it the ghost of Rang's fire, a reminder that even ruin can burn with justice. When the smoke of Rang faded, and the age of the raids gave way to quiet, the cross rose over the ruins. In every port the Vikings once ruled Dublin, York, Rouen. The church came to bless what the axe had built. The priests preached salvation, but their ledgers spoke another language. They had inherited not only the land of the pagans, but their trade. The markets did not vanish. They moved indoors, behind walls of stone and hymns of mercy. Monasteries became the new counting houses. Captive women were renamed servants, and their labour tithed to God. In York, the abbey kept records so precise they read like inventory. 2 maidens from Eire in service. 1 woman of the Welsh coast, given in penance. 3 of no faith, unbaptized. The scribes inked these lists beside entries of candles, wine, and relics. They were not ashamed. To the priests, the ownership of bodies was not sin but stewardship. Archaeologists, studying the cellars of the great monasteries, found iron rings bolted into the walls, not for storage but restraint. The earth around them was darkened by waste, not grain. A bronze crucifix, discovered in one chamber, had been bent double, its arms twisted inward like chains. The message was clear. Faith had not destroyed the system, it had refined it. The Vikings had trafficked with swords. The Church trafficked with scripture. In London's cathedral archives survives a charter dated to 978 the same year. King Ethelred taxed the slave trade. The document lists servants of God's household bought from Norse captains in exchange for tithes and coin. The Latin phrase used was famula Dei, handmaid of God. Yet these handmaids were confined to laundries and kitchens, their names erased from all but financial records. The revenue funded new churches, their stones laid by the same hands that could never leave their walls. Some priests justified the practice through theology. They claimed the baptized captive became spiritually free, even if her body remained enslaved. In sermons, they compared their bondage to Christ's suffering, as if the crucifixion could sanctify commerce. Those who objected were silenced. When a nun in York wrote a letter condemning her abbess for keeping women as beasts of burden, the record of her order ends the same year. The church profited quietly, efficiently. Its altars gleamed with Norse silver, melted from idols once offered to Thor. Its candles were poured from the fat of conquered herds. Its incense burned over the labour of women who would never see daylight again. The monks prayed for the souls of their benefactors, not their victims. Centuries later, the stained glass still catches the light over those same foundations. Beneath it, the stone floors are uneven, settled over the bones of the forgotten. Tourists kneel there now, unaware that every echo in those vaulted halls was once a whisper of chains. The Vikings had called their markets temples of silver. The church simply made them temples of God. Beneath the cobbled streets of York lies a silence older than the city itself. In the late 19th century, when workmen dug foundations near Coppergate, they struck something strange. A grid of stone chambers arranged like cells, each scarcely larger than a coffin. At first, scholars thought they were crypts. Then they found chains. These chambers dated to the late 9th century, when Jorvik Viking York was the richest stronghold in the Danelaw. The Norse ruled the surface with law and trade, but below the city ran another kind of order, the breeding halls. There, captives from Ireland, Scotland, and the Saxon lands were held not to serve, but to bear. The sagas do not mention them, the priests never recorded them, yet the bones do not lie. Archaeologists found 64 cells carved into clay and lined with timber. Iron rings were fixed into the walls at wrist height, and the soil was heavy with the traces of straw, milk, and ash. There were no weapons, no coins, no animal remains, only fragments of female bone and the small skeletons of infants. Forensic testing revealed a cycle of habitation spanning nearly 4 decades. Generations of women had passed through, each replacing the last. The Norse economy in York depended on expansion, more farms, more soldiers, more servants. But the raids that once supplied them with captives were slowing. To sustain their empire, they turned their cities into engines of reproduction. The captives' children, half Norse by blood, were baptized and registered as foundlings, their lineage erased before their first breath. Church records preserved at York Minster list hundreds of such baptisms, each labelled puer ignotus, unknown child. Inside one of the cells, a spindle whorl was found carved with the rune for fey wealth. Scholars debate whether it was left by a guard or a prisoner. Perhaps both understood that life itself had become the currency. Beside it lay a wooden toy horse, carved crudely by definites of definites, in hand, still smooth from being held. In its simplicity lingered the human hand behind the horror. A single inscription scratched into the wall survives. We give them names, they take them away. The etching was shallow, made with something dull, perhaps a nail, perhaps a bone. It remains one of the few direct voices of a captive woman in Viking Britain. Her words outlived her body by 1,000 years. By the time the Normans conquered York in 1066, the breeding halls had been sealed and forgotten. The new rulers inherited their labour and their silence. The city grew upward, layer upon layer, while the underground remained untouched, a buried wound beneath the feet of generations. Today, the museum that stands above Coppergate displays beads, tools, and ornaments from Viking York, but the walls below still breathe when the air turns cold. Guides say the stones sweat at night, as if remembering. Perhaps they do. Beneath the glass cases of history lies the truth. The earth refused to bury the place where the future of a nation was born in chains. In the hills above the River Derwent, where fog creeps low across the grass even in summer, a single stone once stood apart from all others. It was not large or ornate, like the royal monuments at Jelling or Stenkirke. It was crude, its carvings shallow and hurried. Yet what it said has haunted every scholar who's read it. Better far, better this way. The rune stone of regret, as it would later be named, was unearthed in the ruins of an abandoned Viking farmstead near Repton, the same region where mass graves of Norse women were found. The stone had fallen inward into a burial pit, half buried among bones that told of systematic execution. 236 bodies, all female, most showing signs of strangulation or blunt trauma. Carbon dating placed them at the close of the Viking Age, when Norse power in England was collapsing. The inscription's simplicity made it almost unbearable. No dedication, no invocation to gods or kin, only those two words. Archaeologists found the runestone near the skull of a girl no older than 14. The runes had been carved after her death, the cuts clean and bright compared to the weathered surface. Whoever wrote them took the time to explain what the sagas never dared admit, that some killers sought not glory but justification. The final years of Norse rule were an unravelling. Armies retreated, trade faltered, and Viking settlements across England fell to the advancing Saxons. In their panic, the Norse destroyed what could not be carried, and silenced those who could not be trusted to keep their secrets. Captive women were executed, so they could not testify to the horrors of the slave halls. Even Norse-born wives and daughters were killed to prevent them from being taken by the enemy. What had begun as conquest ended as annihilation. The runestone of regret is not unique. Across Scandinavia, several lesser-known stones bear strange, sorrowful phrases. He chose mercy, no blame, and the sea took them, not I. These inscriptions break the pattern of boast and tribute that defined traditional runic art. They sound more like confessions than memorials. Linguists suggest they were carved by those who carried unbearable guilt warriors, fathers, husbands, men who had turned their blades inward when the world they built began to collapse. At Repton, soil tests revealed mercury residue near the mass grave, the same poison once used to sedate victims before execution. The mixture dulled terror, ensuring silence. Those who ordered the killings must have watched them die quietly, believing they were sparing them from the fate they themselves had inflicted on others. When the stone was moved to a museum in Derbyshire, curators debated how to display it. In the end, they left it unpolished, streaked with the same dirt that had hidden it for centuries. Visitors often pause before the inscription, whispering the words aloud, "Better this way." Some say it sounds like justification, others hear a plea. Either way, it speaks. And in that quiet voice, the Viking Age confesses. The discovery came in the spring rains of 1996, when a team of archaeologists dug into a low rise beside the old church at Repton, expecting yet another burial mound from the Great Army's winter camp. What they found instead was silence pressed into earth, 236 skeletons, all female, stacked in orderly layers beneath a slab of limestone. The soil above them was dense with ash, charcoal, and soot. This was not a battlefield grave, it was something else. Each skeleton bore signs of deliberate execution. Some skulls showed blunt trauma, others the clean groove of strangulation. Several had traces of mercury in the bone's slow poison, used perhaps to subdue them before death. The isotopic data revealed they were Norse by birth, not captives. The grave dated to the final years of Viking rule in England. when the Norse settlements collapsed under English and Norman pressure. These were not enemies slain in war. They were wives, daughters, and servants killed by their own. The chronicles are silent, but the evidence speaks plainly. In the last desperate months of Norse control, as strongholds fell and armies fled, those who remained feared what would happen if their women were captured. They had seen what the victors did, the forced marriages, the slave markets, the punishments. And so they did what fear does when it becomes law. They turned mercy into murder. The final act of the Viking Age was not a conquest, but a cleansing. Among the dead, one skull bore a runic inscription carved after death. Ek betra svar, I am better this way. The same phrase appeared on another stone found nearby, the runestone of regret. The words, carved carefully into bone, suggest the killers needed to explain their act even to the dead, perhaps to the gods, perhaps to themselves. It was a logic born of a world that had forgotten how to stop killing. Around the pit, fragments of jewellery and tools lay scattered wedding rings, spindle whorls, combs, bronze keys, worn at the waist by married women. Keys were symbols of household authority. To take them from a woman was to take her power. The killers left them there, as if to bury not just the bodies, but the idea of the home itself. The longhouses were empty now. The age of raids, of ships, of burning was over. What replaced it was dust. When the mass grave was finally opened to the public, a plaque was placed beside it that read, "The end of the Viking Age in England." But the bones told a different story. The Viking Age did not end with kings or battles or crowns. It ended here in a shallow pit, among the women whose deaths marked the last attempt to control what could no longer be owned. Rain still fills the depression every spring. Locals call it the mirror pond, because when the water settles, the reflection is unnaturally clear. They say if you look long enough, you can see faces staring back. When the last sails disappeared from the English horizon, the world did not cheer. It exhaled. The raids that had thundered across coasts for 2 centuries were finally over. No more smoke rising from monasteries, no more drums echoing in the fog. The longships that once defined terror were rotting on their keels, their dragon heads eaten by salt and time. Yet the end of the raiders did not come from defeat alone. It came from within, from exhaustion, from the slow decay of a people who had consumed themselves. The chronicles of the 12th century speak of a softening of the north. They describe a generation that no longer knew the old gods, who prayed to Christ but still wore Thor's hammer around their necks, just in case. The warlords had become landlords. Their swords turned to ploughs, their halls to courts, but the ghosts of conquest lingered in every corner of their new order. The women who survived the centuries of violence now served in silence, the daughters of captives nursing the sons of kings. Archaeologists studying Norse farmsteads from this period noticed something strange. A pattern of deliberate burial beneath doorways and hearths. Infants, sometimes women, sometimes both together. The practice dated from pagan times, but persisted into the Christian age. The scholars debated whether these were sacrifices or memorials. Perhaps they were neither. Perhaps they were apologies the old world, trying to atone beneath the flaws of the new. In Iceland, poets began to sing of different heroes, not raiders or conquerors, but men who stayed home. Farmers, lawgivers, storytellers. The Íslendingasagur transformed bloodshed into memory, softening the edges of brutality with verse. The violence that had built their world became legend, something to recite by firelight rather than repeat. But the sagas never mentioned the women buried in foreign soil, nor the graves beneath the markets. Their silence became part of the myth, the foundation on which civilization was rebuilt. In Norway, the great shipyards fell quiet. The forests that had fed them grew thick again, swallowing the paths once trod by armies. The sea that had carried death for generations returned to its rhythm of tides and storms. For the first time in memory, the wind across the fjords smelled only of salt, not of burning. The last Viking raid on English soil came in the year 1048, a small fleet crushed by storm and hunger before it ever reached shore. Chroniclers barely noted it. The age that had begun in flame ended in silence. Yet even as peace spread, the legacy of those centuries endured. Across the North Sea, the graves of women still whisper beneath the grass, and the bones of warriors still clutch rusted weapons as if unwilling to let go. The raiders were gone, but their shadow remained. Every church raised on a plundered site, every silver coin stamped with a cross instead of a hammer, every story told around a fire carried the same inheritance, the memory of a people who mistook conquest for eternity and found only ashes. Centuries have passed since the last longship slipped beneath the horizon, yet the North has never stopped whispering. The earth still remembers. Every shovelful of soil turned in Repton, Dublin, or York brings up fragments of that buried world, a rusted link of chain, a bead of blue glass, a child's tooth polished by time. The chronicles wrote of kings and battles, but it is the bones that speak the truth. They tell a quieter story, one not of glory, but of consequence. In the laboratories of modern archaeology, the dead have found their voices again. Under microscopes, their teeth reveal the minerals of distant lands, proof of capture and transport. Their ribs tell of starvation, their skulls of violence. Isotope scans show journeys from Ireland to Norway, from the Welsh coast to the Volga. DNA shows what the sagas denied, that the blood of the Norse was not pure but mixed with that of their captives. The descendants of slaves and conquerors walk the same earth, indistinguishable except for what lingers deep in the bone. In Iceland, genetic studies revealed that 60% of maternal ancestry comes from the British Isles, while paternal lines remain overwhelmingly Scandinavian. It means what the old poems could never admit. The settlers' wives were not their countrywomen, but the spoils of raids. Every Icelandic lullaby sung today carries the unrecorded voice of a woman who crossed the sea in chains. Museums display their remains behind glass, labelled, categorized, stripped of names. Yet even in stillness, the bones seem to accuse. They remind us that civilization is never clean. The Viking Age built trade routes, towns, and law codes, but it did so on backs that bent and throats that stayed silent. The myths of adventure of brave explorers and fearless warriors cannot drown out the rhythm of what came after. The slow creak of oars, the clink of manacles, the muffled cries below deck. At Repton, the skull bearing the inscription, "I'm better this way," rests in a climate-controlled case. Visitors lean close, whispering as if afraid to wake her. Some feel pity, others revulsion, but the skull needs neither. She already told her story 1,000 years ago, through the hand that carved those words, through the earth that kept them safe, through the silence that demanded to be broken. The sagas end with kings converted, empires built, and warriors glorified. The bones end differently. They end with the quiet insistence that history is not made by the victors alone, but by those whose bodies became its foundation. When the northern winds blow across the graves of Repton, they carry a sound softer than speech. The faint rattle of loosened earth, the whisper of names long unspoken. The Viking Age is over, but its dead still talk. They do not praise, they do not curse. They simply tell the truth that every empire, however mighty, leaves behind the bones that speak.